Hello, guys, and welcome back to another episode of TBPodcast, the best podcast series. Today, I'm here with Dr. Laura Hirshfield, a lecturer and researcher at the Chemical Engineering Department here at UMich. So, if you'd like to introduce yourself, Laura, that'd be great.
Yeah, so as you said, I'm a lecturer and researcher, so I have a lot of different roles here. So my title right now is Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Lecturer, which means that for part of my appointment, I'm teaching classes in first year programs in chemical engineering. And then another part of my appointment is helping focus on DEI initiatives for the College of Engineering broadly. And then another piece of that is that I do research in the engineering education space, kind of also focused on DEI issues.
Okay. So, I understand, that wasn't your initial, career path, though, right? I think so.
Yeah, it's interesting
Yeah.
because I went to grad school. I went here for undergrad first,
Yeah.
and then went to grad school at Purdue in the chemical engineering department. And so on one hand, this career path is exactly what I wanted because I knew I wanted to go in academia, and I knew I really wanted to focus on supporting and helping people. So as a grad student, I picked pharmaceuticals as my research area. So my PhD is in pharmaceuticals. But I kind of felt actually really disconnected from the
see.
people. I felt like I was just in a lab looking at droplets of pharmaceutical ingredients and I wasn't super passionate about it. And you're not seeing the people that you're actually impacting, right? And also with pharma, it's so far away from being implemented that it didn't even feel that impactful yet. And so when I was at Purdue, I learned about engineering education research and was really passionate about that. So then when I did a postdoc, after I finished my PhD, I switched fields.
Your postdoc was.
In a chemical
Okay.
engineering space, but focused on technology-aided learning.
I see.
So
Okay.
I helped study students who were engaged with a virtual lab experience, and this is in 2013, 2014. So then it was just an alternative to a physical lab space, and then in 2020 it became actually a lot more relevant.
Yeah,
7
'cause of
years
COVID.
after I was working on it.
Yeah,
So yeah, that was focused on chemie students, but looking at different ways they could be engaged in the classroom. And then I did a second postdoc here at Michigan in the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching in Engineering. And that was a little bit of a pivot, focusing on students working in teams and how they developed confidence and how that related to different tasks that they did in the project.
Okay.
So now my work has kind of evolved to focusing more on how students' identities impact how they work in teams. And so that can be, I focus most on gender and stereotypes related to that, but it can also be other aspects of your identity and your past experiences and how that can support or inhibit your team experience. And so I feel before 2020, a lot of engineers like numbers, right?
Yeah.
When they think of data as an engineering student or as an engineer, you think of Excel sheets of numbers. And so me coming in and being here are some interviews and here are students' lived experiences, people didn't always buy into that as important or as real data.
Yes.
And I think 2020, when we saw how, we had to pivot how we were teaching students and people had to make it more accessible. There was no alternative. I feel that kind of opened people's eyes to oh, it's not this kind of research is an extra thing. We actually really need this.
Yeah.
So I actually think more people appreciate my work. Now I have to spend less time trying to convince people it's important. But in terms of team dynamics, people weren't really working much in teams over Zoom. You might be in a breakout room, but I don't think that really.
It's not the same. Right?
Yeah, and people act differently on Zoom than they do in person, right? So I think that we're still seeing and maybe forever going to see effects of people not having to work much in teams and also not having to be very social for a very formative time in your development, and then seeing how that's showing up in teamwork now.
I think part of it is it's much easier to talk to someone through a screen than it is to talk to someone in person. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think also the interpersonal skills piece, that's always been huge for me because I feel very grateful to have gone to U of M for undergrad because of the TechCom program.
Yeah.
I think I am a way better engineer because of how much tech comm training I got
Mm-hmm.
as an undergrad. And so I've always really been interested in like how students are developing those skills when most of our classes are focused on theory and
Mm-hmm. Yes.
math
Yeah.
and kind of like algorithmic problem solving. So that's
Mm-hmm.
like another reason I'm interested in team-based learning, is because like you also have to develop like project management, communication, critical thinking, like social skills, like all these interpersonal skills and professional skills. And I think also before COVID, I mean, people call those soft skills,
Mm-hmm.
which I think diminishes their importance,
Yeah.
but also
Mm-hmm.
diminishes how hard they are. And now they're even more difficult for students. So, like, nothing is soft about those kinds of skills anymore. And so I think COVID has also shifted, like, and also AI has shifted. Like, now if you have to do a fluids problem, like, you can plug it into ChatGPT and, like, maybe it won't be right. Like, I don't think we're quite there, but, like,
Yeah.
you'll get most of the way there. But if I'm asking you to do a design work, like you can't solve that in AI. So I also feel like the kind of work I study, I'm just so passionate about. Like that's, I think, what we most need to focus on in our curriculums. And
Mm-hmm.
so post COVID, it's even harder to ignore that.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to talk more about your actually like your research at. You said your postdoc at Oregon State. Yeah.
Yeah. So I looked at, I actually like did an ethnographic study, which means that you're
Mm-hmm.
following around students and you're trying to see like the authentic way that they're interacting with each other, but also with the virtual lab. So anytime the team met, I was there, like regardless of what hour of the day it was, which I could like not do anymore now that I need like my 6 hours sleep. But it was really interesting to me to see how differently teams were based on gender makeup.
Mm-hmm.
So there were teams of 3. So usually it would be either all men
Okay.
or 2 men and a woman,
Uh-huh.
just because there are less women in engineering.
Yeah.
And so just seeing like how differently women engaged in the virtual lab compared to men was really interesting to me. And so I think that's kind of what inspired like the work once I left
Mm-hmm.
Oregon State, is
Yeah.
like really focusing on gender.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
It's really cool.
yeah.
This is really interesting. Male and female students discuss technical content equally, but female students answer significantly more non-technical questions. So, why do you think that happened to be the case there? So,
Yeah, I mean, I think that that just exemplifies stereotypes that
uh-huh.
women are better at. Um, we call them non-technical skills, even though that to me that doesn't mean that they're any less important in
Yeah.
engineering.
Uh-huh.
But I think there are stereotypes that women are more likely to be better at making slides or writing or formatting
Mm.
reports
Yeah.
or making sure that meetings happen and organizing those meetings and
Mm-hmm.
sending emails and taking notes
Mm-hmm.
and things that are non-technical.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a stereotype that men are more likely to be successful in the technical space.
Mm-hmm.
But that's also because, I mean, it's a stereotype because at one point it was true, because engineering was built to be like a male profession,
Mm-hmm.
right? So a lot of like traditional engineering stuff is seen as masculine, like
Mm-hmm.
building robots, drones,
Circuits, right?
circuits.
Yeah.
Yeah, like
So,
a
uh-huh.
lot of like the larger majors here, like ME, CS, are very built around like spaces that were traditionally catered towards
Mm-hmm.
men. And then women are traditionally considered to be better in the non-technical space. And
Mm-hmm.
so I felt like this finding just kind of like aligned with stereotypes.
Okay. Yeah. I recently just learned that actually when students have like complaints about a course, they're more likely to go to a female professor
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to going talking to a male professor also,
Mm-hmm.
which is really interesting because I feel that like I wasn't really sure like necessarily why that is. Maybe because like people feel that like women are more approachable than men.
Well, I think
So
it's
it's like
like the view that women are more nurturing,
I see. Okay.
which might be true
Yeah.
in some
Uh-huh.
cases, but women also get way weirder and worse teaching evaluations.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. I
Mhm.
mean, worse in terms of like just women are judged more harshly.
Mhm.
Students, I think, feel more comfortable saying strange comments that men might not necessarily get.
Okay.
So definitely like being a female faculty is, you see a lot of this stuff that just gets amplified even more and more, like the more I go on in my career.
Interesting. Okay. I also wanted to talk about more about your research here at at Michigan as well. So what kind of like studies have you been doing here as you know in your
Yeah,
research? So
so after I left Oregon State, I mentioned I came back here for a postdoc, and started looking at students working in teams and how they developed confidence and what tasks related to that. So it actually like led very well from the virtual lab work, and that I was really interested, especially in that non-technical task space, and how like biases and stereotypes might play into the tasks that students pick up in projects. And so I started with studying students in Engineering 100. And then that's how I ended up teaching it, actually, is because I was studying it for 2 years, and then I asked to teach a section. So now I focus a little more, it's gotten a little more broad from that, and like looking at, I mentioned like student experiences in teams, not just in the tasks that they pick up, but just like every aspect of that experience. So, like, team satisfaction, like what leads to productive experiences versus unproductive experiences, and like how your identity impacts how you show up in the space, but also how others are perceiving you in the space.
okay.
And so I also started looking at just like class teams. So usually like design classes, I mentioned Engineering 100. I also did look at like some senior design teams, and now I'm kind of expanding my definition of teams more broadly because I'm interested in how people like informally form groups
Oh
as
yeah.
well. And so I've also done some work as part of my DEI role for the college in looking at like how people feel like they belong or don't belong in their major. Like thinking about a major is also like kind of a team or a grouping. And so how some majors inhibit diversity and how others encourage it and things like that. So I'm using teams like very broadly.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
studies have shown that a more diverse team leads to better outcomes. So if people have different experiences and different worldviews, like of course you're going to come with different ideas and different insight into what you're creating, and so that leads to something that's going to be better in the end because it'll be better for more people. Like if you have more insight as you're creating the solution, but there's also something that's really inspired my current work is work that I collaborate with Robin Fowler here, who's in tech comm and also engineering education. And she did a quantitative study looking at students in Engine 100 and looking how gender makeup influenced team satisfaction. And she found that team satisfaction was statistically significantly lower in teams that had two or more women compared to teams of all men or teams of one woman. And that was including like the team satisfaction on average overall across the members, but also the women on the team. So it kind of like implying that women were more satisfied with their team when they were alone on a team compared to if they had another woman with them.
Interesting. Yeah.
And that's against what I think anyone would expect. And so she did that work, I think, in like 2014. And then so we partnered together because we were both doing different ways of looking at teamwork. And so we've kind of like, that's inspired everything we've worked on since then. Right.
Like,
So after that, we did interviews. Because that's why, like, the survey data shows things, but it doesn't explain why or how. And so we did interviews to like investigate that why or how. And so that was really enlightening because we also talked about like different, maybe like stereotypical reasons we thought that might be. So we thought like, do women feel like they're in competition with other women? Like, do women feel like if they're not friends with another woman, they can't work well? Like, we were trying to think of like, what are different reasons this could be? And what we think we're landing on at this point. And now, so we did those interviews. We leveraged the results of those interviews into a survey that we sent out last year. And so what we're thinking might be the case is that if a woman is mistreated or any person of a marginalized identity is mistreated and they're the only person around them that has that identity, it's easy to take it personally and say like, oh, well, I'm not, of course, like I'm not good at building, or like this isn't the right major for me. Or, but if you're seeing yourself treated that way and someone else who shares an identity factor with you treated the same way by other members of your team, you might be more likely to realize, like, in this case, maybe it's misogynistic treatment. So maybe it's like, oh, this is nothing personal. This is because I'm a woman and they maybe don't trust me as much as like their male teammates. And so we're calling that co-awareness, that like you come to that awareness only when you see it happen to someone else.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like the theory of like bystander intervention, that it's like easier to stand up for other people and easier to see something happening to other people as it is compared to yourself.
Yeah. And then this quote says, "We were both noticing it." Sorry, we were both noticing it separately, and we could tell that we were both getting annoyed by it. We brought it up aside from the group, and we talked about it, and realized the extent to which it was happening. Being alone, it's hard to see. Like you said, being alone, it's you tend to blame yourself a lot for things that aren't really your fault. So yeah.
Well, and especially another difference in like male and female experience is that men tend to blame external factors more. Like if students fail a test, a man is more likely to say like, oh, the test was poorly written, or like, oh, didn't get enough sleep that day, or like, which, not that those are invalid critiques necessarily, but women are more likely to take it internally and be like, oh, I wasn't prepared, and like, I am not good enough to be in this class. And so I feel like this can definitely, we're talking about gender here, but it can be any form of identity. But with regards to women, like, we are more likely to take things internally and personally than men are.
I also want to go back when we talked about how men are generally more like, at least in a team setting, men generally do more of the technical stuff, and women do more of the non-technical stuff. So,
well, that's interesting because that is stereotypically true, and probably in actuality true most of the time, that people still take on stereotypical tasks, so women doing more non-technical work and men doing more technical work. But I do think that gap is closing. It's less like insidious than it was maybe even like 10 years ago. But we did several studies where students reported amount of time spent on different tasks, and then found that those weren't necessarily the best way to measure task allocation. And there was one paper I have where I did an ethnographic study again, where I followed around a team, and this was a team of 1 woman and 3 men. And one of the men recorded spending so much time on the written report. And looking at the numbers, it's like, great. Like, they didn't just designate it to the 1 woman on the team. Like, it really was like, actually, like, one of the male teammates did more of the work. But in the meeting where they were working on the written report, where he reported, 4 hours working on the report, he actually was sleeping.
Oh.
And so it's like, I think he reported it as time spent on the written report because they were at a meeting designated to working on that, but he wasn't actually doing any of the writing. So we realized like time on task was not necessarily the best metric for looking at task allocation. But we did use that data to look at how reported time on different tasks related to different metrics. So one, like, if there was a difference based on gender identity or based on how it related to different metrics of confidence and things like that.
Honestly, I will say I am also I do not like the writing part of team projects. And the one thing I found really funny actually is this. So I remember you talked about this prior, was about like relationship between team satisfaction and task choice.
So we also, over the course of the semester, just like they were reporting their time, they also were reporting satisfaction with their team on different metrics, which we ended up averaging and seeing how that changed over the course of the semester. And when teams are spending more time on tech comm deliverables, so like spending a lot of time on writing, so like maybe you've done most of the tech work and now you're just communicating it, team satisfaction goes down. So, I mean, I get it. Like, I'm not judging you for saying you don't like writing. I do think that's part of it, but I do also think part of it is like when we teach and talk about teamwork, we're usually talking about like, how are you going to work on this solution in a productive way? And it's harder to allocate time to also like, how do you work on a report collaboratively in a productive way? So I think like teamwork looks different based on what you're working on too. So I think it's like not just related to spending all the time on writing, it's also just like pretty difficult to
Yeah.
co-write, especially with like Google Docs when you're watching someone else like edit something you just wrote and you feel personally attached. Like
Yeah.
I just think there's a lot of like dissatisfaction in
Yeah.
in co-writing.
Mhm.
So I think that's kind of part of it.
Yeah, and I might put this graphic up on the screen, but it's actually really funny to see that like team dissatisfaction spikes as soon as you get to the part of the project where you start writing the report.
Yeah.
It's just
I know, that
not
was a
really funny.
bummer.
That's just kinda really funny, like because I can relate to that. So
I mean,
yeah,
I think I get
I'm
it
sure most people can
too.
relate to
Yeah.
that. So yeah. So as we near the end of time here, I wanted to ask you the one final topic, and that's how has your work in engineering like benefited the DEI climate here?
Yeah. I mean, I hope that my findings, like just talking about dissemination of our work, right? So like I write papers, I do presentations, I do seminars, I present at conferences. Like I'm hoping in all of those people are taking my findings and being more thoughtful about how they're teaching and how they're interacting with students. But then I also have used like my engineering ed background in my DEI role for the college. And so that was kind of looking at any data we have that can help describe people's perceptions of climate here with regards to DEI. So if they feel like they're included in the community, if they feel like they belong, if they feel like they're having an equitable experience, if they perceive that we have a diverse community, things like that. And so I looked at, you know, that you get so many surveys a year. Like I think students get, I think at one point they counted it was like 80 something surveys a
80
year.
surveys?
And I'm sure most of those emails just
Oh
pass you by.
yeah, I
But one of those is a climate survey. There's another one that has some issues related to climate in the survey. And so I looked at different surveys that had to do with like DEI climate, and analyzed those like quantitative metrics. And then from that, again, leveraged that into like investigating more about student experiences and did focus groups with students in every major and program here. Because we found big differences between in the quantitative metrics between different programs. And so we kind of wanted to explain why that was. And like probably even anecdotally as students, you see these differences. Like I mentioned before, CS is like less diverse.
Yeah.
Like in terms of demographics compared to like BME or IOE are more diverse.
Yeah,
And
CS
so
has a lot of people who look like me. So
yeah. I mean, I think
that's,
it's last time I looked, I think it was maybe like 15% women, compared to like college at large is 25%
Oh wow.
women.
Okay.
And then of course,
Yeah.
like considering proportion of like Hispanic or Black students as well. So it's just like why are students gravitating towards some majors and maybe not joining other majors? Some majors, like there's difference in like satisfaction with opportunities that they have for them or teaching opportunities. Like why do those differences arise? So we did these focus groups to kind of look at like different experiences that students are having in different majors and hoping that the good things that departments are doing can kind of perpetuate across campus to help every department better serve their students.
I see. Yeah. So looking more at this table here, that's really interesting. So why are some of them highlighted yellow here? I mean, I'll probably put this graphic up on the screen too.
Yeah, so I highlighted yellow if it seemed more interesting to me, which to me meant it was on either end of the extreme. So you can see based on this, like the green numbers represent if it was above the COE average and red means it's below. And so like engineering, physics, name, and NERS in every metric of satisfaction. So looking at how satisfied students are with different aspects of advising, course offerings, engagement with faculty, opportunities, teaching in the classroom, things like that. In engineering, physics, name, and NERS, students are above average, satisfied in every regard.
It's also because they're smaller majors, right? So,
that actually, that was like one of the biggest things we found is like having a smaller department means there's more likelihood for a community to form. So that was one piece of it. And then, I have computer engineering and CS highlighted because they had more that were below average,
Wow.
which
Okay.
CS obviously is the biggest
Yeah,
major
I
by
can see it.
fall. But
Yeah.
also, I
So.
think it does come into play with stereotypes about, like you mentioned before, we were talking about like stereotypical masculine coded tasks, like
Mhm.
circuits being one of those. So, like
Yeah.
having to do with EECS or computer engineering. So, things that are seen as more like traditional engineering, and I'm like using quotes when I
Yeah.
say that, can be less seen as less accessible
Oh.
to students.
Yeah, and it's really I see that it says access to faculty CS is really low, like the lowest. And I know that in like at least in CS, like there's so many students and
Mm-hmm.
the access to faculty is really low. And I know that like for them, there's a ton of IAs for the classes, which makes it
Mm-hmm.
hard to like talk to the professor. So that really,
Well, and it was
yeah.
interesting because,
So
like, this is just numerically right. And it's usually response rate on surveys is like 25% or less.
oh wow,
So, like,
okay.
this isn't representing every student's experience, but
Uh-huh.
it's just averages. But doing the focus groups gave a lot more insight into these numbers. So, the access to faculty piece is something we talked a lot in the
Uh-huh.
CS undergrad
Yeah.
focus group, because I did focus groups with undergrads and grads.
Mhm.
But undergrads, we spent a lot of time talking about like issues with office hours.
Okay.
And they're
I see.
obviously trying to improve that with like the queuing system and
Uh-huh.
all the ways that, but it's like students just literally cannot get the help that they need when there's so many students in CS classes.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
So yeah, even like when I took engineering 100 or sorry, engineering 101, that's even though it's not like a CS class,
yeah.
like I felt that just so
Yeah.
seriously. I was just like it was oversaturated, and so the
Mhm.
quality can just go down from there. And then yeah, it's really interesting to see name really high. That
Yeah, that
yeah, so
actually, I'm
yeah.
glad you brought that up because
Uh-huh.
that was another piece. Is like we saw that smaller majors tend to have like higher sense of community and belonging, and
Mhm.
so that leads to a
Yeah.
better experience. But also, students who came in like knowing they wanted to do that major tend to be happier.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
usually students here who aero is like one of the biggest ones. Like students come in and they know they want to do aero.
Mhm.
There aren't that many students that come in thinking they want to do something else and then fall into aero. NERS and name
Mhm.
um are another like more specialized ones. And
Mhm.
so yeah, having like more passion or like devotion to the
Mhm.
major means that like you're more likely to find belonging because like you are committed to it.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So yeah, that was another piece of it
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, it's really interesting also because personally, as a chemical engineering major, I know that our major is kind of small, but like the
Mhm.
satisfaction actually is actually pretty high, honestly. Like just from looking at this, like
Well, I think
so.
chemi is hard because it doesn't have that like people graduate and still don't know what chemi is, right?
Yeah, that's
Like
just true.
so
Yeah.
there are some people that I mean there are a lot of people that come here and they're like I loved chemistry, so I want to do chemi, or maybe you
Mhm.
have like a parent or family friend or guardian who did chemi, so you know what it is, but we don't have the benefit of people knowing a lot about us when they join.
Mhm.
So that
That's true.
definitely can be a
Mhm.
negative.
Yeah. Moving on from that, so you said you did like these like focus groups, right? So like, what are some like things that you found about like the Michigan culture from that? So yeah,
Yeah.
that's interesting to know about. So.
No, those are really interesting. So I ended up talking to like almost more than 200 students between all of the focus groups, and it was really interesting to see themes that arose from those. Because of course, like I love talking to people. Period.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
that's why I'm in this work, and so I love like learning about people and their stories. So like every focus group, I feel like was really interesting to me. But once I'd done all of them and started to like really analyze the data, like seeing what was common across a lot of them was also interesting. And so one thing we found was that in terms of equity or maybe like inclusion as well, um, undergrad students talked more about like feeling judged or receiving like biased comments from their peers,
Mhm.
which I feel like especially supported my research work that I do, like focusing on student team satisfaction, because that's
Mhm.
most often like when it comes up is if you're working in a team with people that you maybe don't know,
Mhm.
is when you might find yourself experiencing some of those kinds of comments.
Mhm.
And then for grad students, most often was talking about like interactions with their advisor and their research group.
Mhm.
And so from that, I started doing work looking at how we can help foster more inclusive mentoring strategies. So now it's like I'm focused on inclusive mentoring at the grad level, inclusive teams at the undergrad level. But we also talked about just like overall different factors that impact inclusion. And something that's interesting about engineering is like the challenge of it really brings students together. Like when you're working in the dude or the ugly at 2 a.m. and you see like other chemies there, like that fosters a sense of community.
Yeah.
That you're like, oh, we're all working on this like heat and mass
Yeah.
homework together,
like
right?
trauma bonding, is that what it's called? Yeah, people say trauma bonding. Like
Well, people misuse that term, so it's not necessarily that, but it is like, yeah, going through something hard together and
yeah.
is challenging. Something also is interesting is like going on the bus together creates community
Yeah,
because
that's definitely
people
true.
hate that
Yes.
engineering is a separate campus here at U of M, but you see the same kind of people on the buses and like just having that like sense of normalcy that you see the same people and like you can chat on the bus like for those 15 minutes, like that creates community.
Yeah, it really does. Yeah.
But it was also, of course, like those can have negatives. So like the buses, it wastes some time that you can't just walk to class. Like you have to get on the bus, especially in the beginning of the semester. The bus can be kind of a nightmare.
It's awful.
But then also like that challenge can have really negative effects on mental health.
Yeah.
And so we talked a lot about like grind culture and expectation that you're, you know, it's like a badge of honor to talk about how busy you are, talk about how little sleep you got, like especially one interesting aspect of it was like when talking about recruitment, especially for CS students and how competitive that can be. It's like applying for a job or applying for grad schools can be feel like a whole other job or like a whole other class that you're taking, and you're having to do that on top of all your work, and it just can create this environment where people there's no balance, right?
Yeah.
And so when there's no balance, you're not making time for self-care and you can't really take care of your mental health. And we saw like some pretty extreme examples of that with one CS undergrad student was talking about how they were working to like commit to get one of their homework assignments, and they were in the fishbowl, and there was this loud noise that people thought maybe was a gunshot.
Wow.
And they made sure, I'm getting chills even just recounting this because it was really so upsetting to hear, but they made sure to commit their homework to get before packing up their stuff and running because they were so worried if they didn't get this homework in on time, like what that would mean for their future. And like thinking, and it ended up being that it was balloons that were popped. Which, but also like that's the world we live in, right?
Yeah.
That like I would be terrified too if I heard something like that. And so, but
you know, we always think of the worst case scenario, right? So that's.
But I mean, it's also America, and unfortunately, it's not. It's not out of the realm of possibility. But the fact that you know this student, their mindset was like, I got to get this assignment in, not I need to like run to potentially protect my life, was like, and in doing this work, like I have to seem biased, right? And or unbiased and like objective. And I was just sitting in the corner of the focus group and like weeping, like just silently like crying because I was like, that is so
that's awful.
horrible that we're fostering that environment. And I worry that things like Michigan difference and leaders in the West can like actually be really negative for students. And that like, of course, we're a highly ranked school and I love the students here. It's one of the best parts of my job is like working with students like you. But I feel like we're failing you if we make you think you have to prioritize your work for classes over your life. And so, yeah, I mean, I love the work that I do, but sometimes it can be really emotionally taxing, for sure.
Great. Well, that is all the time we have, at least for today. Thank you so much, Laura, for coming onto the podcast today, and using a lot of your like very limited and valuable time.
No, thank you for having me. It's always nice to chat with students,
Yeah,
but it was nice to chat with you.
Of course. All right. All right, and thank you for tuning in, guys, and I hope to see you in the next one where I bring in some CAPS representatives. So, all right.